John Robb interviewed Paul Morley about his wonderful new book about the enigmatic and complex Tony or Anthony Wilson. Even the name is complex. It's an amazing book, Paul. There's a lot of you in there, a lot of Manchester, and a lot of Tonys. I mean, how do you set about doing something like this?
Yes, it's an interesting one because I suppose in many ways I set about doing it 40 odd years ago, not really knowing it, but I guess everything, a large part of my life has been doomed or destined, aimed towards this particular book. And then what I realized as well, writing a book about someone like Tony, not necessarily Tony himself, but just what a great opportunity it was for someone who, I wanted to write a particular kind of biography, and there wouldn't be many characters around that you could do a certain kind of biography with because, the thing you wanted to do and write this particular biography of a complicated character. And Tony Wilson was perfect for me to do it because what came first, it is interesting. Did I end up writing this way because of the experiences I've had over the last 45 years? And largely because of the fact that Tony Wilson has been part of my life, or have I ended up doing it this way and it would have happened anyway? But whatever it was, it meant that I was in the perfect place, perfect state to write this kind of book about this kind of person. So I guess there is some kind of weird.
Yeah. I mean, you've written a lot of books about very other complex characters. I mean, Grace Jones is a very complex character as well. Is it a very different approach to write a book about Tony? And is that because you knew him for longer and you are actually part of the story, whether you like it or not?
Yes, I like being part of the story because that sort of helped me sort of locate myself. I've always wanted to be part of the story ever since I started writing about music and things. I've always wanted to make myself part of the story as an emotional response, a sort of, a witness, close witness. So I'm in there, and all the things that influenced me was very much that kind of writing. And that's very Tony as well, putting himself in the story. So, someone who puts himself in the story is writing about someone who puts himself in the story. What was interesting is obviously I started, those that know, I started writing the book quite a while ago for various reasons. It didn't immediately come, which in the long run I was pleased about because a lot of things changed to the history of Manchester, for instance, that meant that if I'd come too early with the book, then it would have been Tony in a different Manchester. Manchester a little bit further into the 21st century is a different place, and then you find that you need to put Tony in a different place because of it. And as I went along, and I took time to write other books, about the Grace Jones, the David Bowies, the Bob, eventually Bob Dylan came after Wilson, but going to the Graces and the Bowies and the history of the North, the history of classical music, and then going back to Tony, what was interesting is Tony stood up to it. I didn't feel like, I've done Bowie. Tony is just this local TV presenter. It was still incredibly challenging and interesting and intriguing and filled with opportunities to write a certain kind of book. Yes, the books that I wrote along the way seemed to help me write the book about Tony. And Tony never diminished within it. I felt more commitment to the idea that someone like Tony Wilson, whatever we think of him, whatever our personal feelings were, someone like that needs to be sort of put into a book. It's one of the last sort of senses we can create a monument for someone. I like the idea of it being a book as well, because Tony loved books. And I love the idea of being a book because it's kind of now become a bit of an old-fashioned thing in a way. But it's the one place you can really experiment with form, and you can do all sorts of extraordinary things with a life and really capture the texture of a life. So it seemed inevitable in the end that the way of remembering Tony for me certainly was writing a book.
I think the book really does capture him in all his fantastic, preposterous different ways. I like the way he's kind of in the book, and he's very in the book, and there's lots of different Tonys running around the book. And there's also kind of the ghost of Tony, and when he's dead, he's not dead. And it's all that playing with form and life and death and realities, which is also very Tony as well.
Yes, it is, because of course Tony in the 1970s, when he was around in the first place for us to notice, was incredibly intellectually ambitious and flexible, and he acted in a way that wasn't immediately recognized what he was doing. I remember him celebrating the history of Manchester, the legacy of the Northwest in the 70s. And it looked a bit peculiar because, we were concentrating on other things, movement, forward, future. and the idea of dwelling on some of those older buildings and dwelling on some of that older history and the things that are now being regenerated at the time was a very perverse, odd, unusual thing to do. And also he was very interesting in the sense that he was also one of the first mainstream broadcasters to take popular culture really seriously, because that was unusual as well, to take it seriously, not just as entertainment or escapism, but something that actually had a big impact on your environment and your surroundings and your reality. And that it also could be an important way that we kind of got our own ability to react and respond and resist, being manipulated by greater forces. He was quite an interesting, inspirational character in that sense, because he'd come out of the late 60s, the revolutionary years, and very much sort of was a student of that, and many of his collaborators and colleagues had been involved quite closely in a lot of the revolutionary sort of events and occasions of the late 60s, and he had that in him, but of course mixed up with the mainstream local television presenter as well. So that created a weird hybrid. So in that sense, he was a wonderfully inspirational mutant, giving you the idea that how you could change shape and shift yourself through your life, and absolutely that commitment he had to making us feel that our location was important. It was incredibly inspiring, and even the sense that we could take the mickey out of him and see him as a bit of a fool seemed to play into it all as well, because he was quite happy to play that character as well. And so from very early on, you were puzzling about him, even just normally.
Yeah, I mean, who was he? There was so many different Tonys, and a lot of self-creation going on. And I like what you put in the book about him actually being an art form, which I think is very much part of that punk or post-punk period. People making themselves into art pieces themselves. They can't make a record, you are the work of art. I mean, how much of that was going on with Tony?
Well, there was a lot, and also that came from other, areas before punk and post-punk, from Dada to Situationism, and even before. I try and explore the roots of Dadaism, going way back even before that idea of creating a self. And he, punk and I mean, I got the feeling in the early to mid 70s, after the revolutions of the late 60s are sort of petered out, and music had become, sort of separate somehow from the idea of a counterculture, if you like, before punk, that he was adrift a little bit, looking for some sort of purpose, looking for something that would connect him with his love for the revolutionary spirit. And even though at 25, 26, he was slightly older than the rest of us at that time in Manchester and the rest of the country, he relished it, because it sort of connected in him that feeling that he'd had in the late 60s of the possibility of a revolution, the possibility of taking control of your own destiny. And he reacted to it very quickly. And of course, that was odd as well, because suddenly there was the 25, 26-year-old with Crosby, Stills and Nash hair hanging out at these venues, and you were a bit suspicious of it. What's he doing here? Is he spying on us? What's he doing? What's he want from us? But he blasted through this, as he often did, charging into every situation like a rhino, relishing it as well. I think he loved the idea that there was something happening, and it was happening on his patch. And he liked it for two reasons. Lots of reasons. He liked it as a fan. He liked it as a journalist, because it was something interesting to report on. And then, of course, he liked it as an instigator, as a participant.
Was it more the energy of it than anything? Like, say with the Sex Pistols, was he more excited by the ideas, the energy, the potential? I mean, was he actually that revolutionary in a traditional form, or more of an arts kind of revolutionary?
Yeah, I think it was cultural, and he saw the way that it would have an impact on the environment, and it was the whole thing, not just the music. In that sense, that separated him. For a lot of people at the time, it was the music. But Tony could see it in a wider sense, I think, and could see that it had a bigger potential for creating possible change. And in that sense, it was an intellectual fascination as much as anything else. And he loved the idea that Manchester started to have a scene, and scenes, that community-minded spirit he had, the idea that energy was coming from within the city that was unique to the city and represented how the people of the city were very different from other people, even just down the road in Liverpool, the uniqueness of the Manchester spirit. And also what he brought to it, which was fantastic, and I think made a difference, even if he was just the focus point for it and it was going on in other places, was that intellectual hunger. And it wasn't just rock or rock and roll or pop music. He was interested in reading and theatre and history. He brought everything into this in the way that a David Bowie did as well. It was taking you to other places very quickly, and you were learning things and you were finding out things beyond the music. But obviously that all then fed into the music, and other cities didn't have a Wilson in a way who could immediately tell you the news about the city, even if he was part of the news himself, because of his broadcasting training. So, Manchester immediately started to get hyped up from within. And the other thing I loved about Tony from very early on with the factory and other things that he did was that because he was from television, it almost seemed like he would put crews around him, a team of people, a producer, the equivalent of a producer, a researcher, sound man, script writer. A lot of us over the years was sort of part of his writing team in a funny sort of way, whether we knew it or not. And he seemed to operate in that way. He would have people working on his behalf or for him, giving him information, supplying him with clues, getting to something first and telling him about it. And then he had this wonderful ability to turn it into the news, give it a headline, give it a catchphrase, a slogan. So he might not have discovered it, he might not have been first to it, but he was the one that distributed it to the wider world and became the face of it, the front of it, very much the front of it. And that was interesting. And it was definitely why Manchester had a different angle then, because no other city, all the great cities after punk had their identity and their local sound and their sonic signature. But Manchester had something more, which was the myth maker, almost encouraging and finding and telling other myth makers to join in, the Peter Savills, the graphics, the writers, the musicians. He kept creating these teams of people that would represent his idea of what Manchester should be. And it was an innovative Manchester as well.
The role of myth maker is so key, isn't it? I mean, not just for the city, but also, I'd imagine, empowering people. So I guess a younger you, and your first relationships with Tony, would you find him empowering, challenging, frustrating?
Yeah, all of that and odd, freakish, intimidating, challenging, and he sulked a lot. He always wanted to bend you to his will. He was up to things that you didn't know quite what he was up to. It turns out in the long run there was a kind of truth to it, or it became truth because he set it in motion. Yes, it was interesting because I had a relationship with him that sort of splintered quite early because I'd moved to Manchester, to London very early on to get to go and work for the NME. And that was quite early in the late 70s. And Tony really didn't like that because part of his whole sort of manifesto, if you like, was that people should come to Manchester. And he was fed up of people leaving Manchester and going, to the south and going to London. I didn't go to London as such. I went to the NME. I always make that distinction. I didn't think, I'm going to London. I thought, I'm going to the NME. And the NME for me was placeless and could still involve Manchester because I would bring that to it, But he was very angry about that and sulked for a considerable period of time. He sulked for a considerable period of time with me, as he did with many of his colleagues and collaborators, when I was stopped writing at the NME in the early 80s about factory bands because they assumed I must be on the payroll or was part of the team or something. And he thought I'd made that decision. And he got very angry about that. So he could be quite spiky. He was very generous and he was very inspirational, but he could also be spiky if he felt you were leaving, the team or you were betraying the principles. And he could be, in a city of sarcasm, he could be the most sarcastic as well, the most withering, because of course he would apply his argumentative nature and his wit to just about every scenario. So you had to be kept on your toes. And I realized over time that a lot of that was coming from his time at Cambridge. He was bringing something into Manchester that was different from the majority of it. He was bringing something else in. And that sort of supplied a lot of his contradictory, argumentative, provocative energy. The idea of trying to create situations all the time to make something happen, and he had such a thick skin that he would try and make things happen, and if they didn't happen, that he would just be on to the next thing, and the rest of us would be left bruised and shaken by the road, wondering what the hell had gone on, But for him, he was still charging forward, always looking for those moments, and occasionally there were these moments when it actually succeeded.
Yeah, I always thought that about him. He obviously being, from Cambridge, the debating thing. He liked debate, didn't he? He liked people who stood up to him. He liked people who disagreed with him, didn't he? He didn't necessarily like people who totally agreed with him.
No, in fact, that's what he was looking for. And yes, he started debating in debating societies at school very early on, pictures of him winning trophies for it. And he loved that, almost for the sake of it, not necessarily because he had a particular point of view, but just the joust, the fight, hoping that some spark would be created that would produce something that could only come out of that situation. He hated demographics. He hated the meetings where you all sit around trying to brainstorm. He hated all of that. And I think he was right. Certainly because, he's been a mentor to me to an extent. I agree with him. The best ideas always come out of surprising collisions of people and ideas and locations and moments. And he was very good at spotting that very early on. And then he tries to encourage them. And sometimes it goes wrong and it's warped and it doesn't work. And other times it does work. And when it does work, it's something like the Hacienda comes out of it with its own weird problems and its own weird history. But ultimately, as a way of imprinting a sensibility on a city through, a piece of architecture, it was quite extraordinary. But again, at the time, it just looked like a madcap plan of no particular direction. But in a way, what he's doing, he's putting something in place and he's saying, okay, here we are. And then seeing how people will use it and work it and make it work. He doesn't know, but he knows that some people will know, and eventually they do. And he's not particularly, well, he's not a dance man. He doesn't understand any of that really. But he's set the situation in motion and he's put the people in there. Some people don't work, other people do. And when the right people do, it becomes something. And then he can play with that. He's got a piece of history that he can manipulate from within.
I love that image in the book of when the Hacienda's at its peak and everyone's downstairs dancing and he's upstairs in the office. Was it listening to Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young?
Yes. Because when he returned, and this is something that I guess one of the points of the book is you're constantly looking for the private Tony, the lonely Tony. Where is Tony, this empty Tony that we never know or see, which is probably the real Tony. And he's packing Tonys around him and he's packing us around him. And somewhere in there is our Tony who's coming up with these ideas, who's still reading, who's still, engaged in some kind of fight with history. And I do love the idea that all the way through, whatever change, Stockholm Monsters, Section 25, the Hacienda years, into the 90s, he's basically still returning to Leonard Cohen and Jackson Browne and Bruce Springsteen because that's where he is and that's where he finds himself, and Bob Dylan and I was always looking for that Tony, that more lonely Tony, the private Tony, which is obviously there somewhere, but he wasn't going to show people because he was always putting on a performance, and then he would go behind the scenes and we wouldn't really know much about him, and trying to find that is a challenge of a biography because of course it is hidden, it is secret, and you can only piece it together from various pieces of evidence that may or may not give you that real Tony, but it gives you the idea that there was this real Tony somewhere.
I mean, how close do you feel you've got to the real Tony?
Well, I got close to the real Tony that is the real Tony for me. And you realize after a while that's all you can do. And I have those guests, if you like, who turn up, members of the family, people who knew him. I wanted to get everybody in. I mean, I couldn't get to you, John. There were so many people I couldn't get to because one of the reasons the book took so long in a way was initially I was trying to get everybody in. And not only was I trying to make it 51 sections, I was trying to make it 501 sections. So I was really having trouble. And then I realized, well, I'll never get this done. And that you can only come in on bits of the action. And then you can only come in on your own version of those bits of the action. And then you'd have some of the people who knew him popping up to give their versions, and they've only got a subjective view too. So you're basically constructing the idea of a Tony Wilson that only I can put together. And that's not to say that's definitive, but it's to say that it gives you a lot of clues about the complexity of the man, the energy of the man, how much he did, what he got up to. And out of that, you can begin to make your own understanding of what he was like and where he belonged and what part of history he came from.
Do you think there was, as you speak to all the different people, you actually get distracted from the real Tony, and everybody's got their own different Tony as well, haven't they?
Yes, that's right. But that's an interesting element of the biography, that the harder you work to get closer to the essential nature of someone, you'll keep being kind of you'll spin off the road because someone will come up with something that completely throws you. And I did love the idea that, again, making it a great kind of biography to write, that within it you can quote Nietzsche and you can quote all his Latin writers, and you can go back to Wordsworth and you can go to Lawrence Stern, but you've also got Richard and Judy in there. And in a way that was almost the central spine of the complex and contradiction of the man, and also the fact that people have a very different idea in their head of who he is. So for Richard and Judy, he's very different from he would be to Vinnie Riley or to Alan Erasmus, but it's all Tony. So you've got all these Tonys spinning around, and everybody thinks they know the Tony. The people who worked at Granada who didn't really see the factory side that didn't really see the Granada side. In fact, he could keep all these lives apart from each other, and somewhere they met in the middle. And I guess, I wanted to make one of the places they met in the middle this particular book. So you do get the idea that, on one hand, he's going out to do a Granada shoot with a boxing kangaroo. And then on the way back to the studios, he's showing his producer where he's going to put the hacienda. And that's Tony. 1 minute it's a boxing kangaroo, the next minute I'm going to open this big super club in the centre of Manchester. And that's where the worlds clash, and very, very few people knew both in a way. The factory crew are begging him to leave Granada because they feel it's making it too much of a hobby for him, factory. And they're the Erasmuses and the Gretons, they're taking it very seriously as an important part of their lives. And the idea that their so-called leader, or certainly their self-elected chairman, is still sticking at being a broadcaster at Granada is not really satisfying them. But he won't leave Granada because also Granada is important to him. And the people at Granada are really annoyed that he's using Granada as a kind of factory office and making all sorts of weird deals. And that, also is this place where the Tonys collide. And there's all sorts of other Tonys that are constantly colliding to create this really unique, whether you're interested in this kind of music, or you're interested in the North or Manchester, or you're interested in any of those sort of elements of history that are in the book, it is still fascinating to watch, a character like Tony Wilson operate and build his life and become what he became, and doing the kind of things he did, and inventing himself, and in doing so inventing a large amount of the image of a city that we now have.
I mean, do you think Tony understood these contradictions within himself, or was it just something he thought was complete, because it's obviously him, it was just seemed really normal, or did he play with them as well?
I think he played with them. I think he knew that he had an energy. I mean, an energy. Where does an energy come from? How come you've ended up with so much? I mean, one of the things that I would marvel about as I was, knowing him and then working on the book, was how much he had in his head, how many people he had in his head. I mean, I can't really do that. I don't know how you are with that, John. I mean, you've got a lot of people in your head, I think, but I found that really unbelievable, the amount of people he knew and that he could keep a connection with, the amount of things he did. He inspired me to do things that, in a funny sort of way, I was never really meant to do, because he showed me that, you could be a journalist and you could also be an instigator, and you could go on TV and you could go on radio. I mean, a large amount I've done that in my life because there was Tony to set the example. And it wasn't something I was ever as comfortable as he was at doing, but it's something I found that myself doing because he'd set the example. He'd said, "Oh, you can do that." Do
you think he found it frustrating that a lot of the disciples actually took part of one of his blueprints and actually did really well out of it? I mean, you did a brilliant job of creating another version of Factory eventually, with Frankie, with the Labourers, stuff like that, and also Dave Picciolinghi, what he's done with Sound City, etc. Everybody who seemed to get some of Tony's energy seemed to go on and do something and become really successful. Or was he proud? Was he proud of the disciples?
I mean, he didn't really say it, and he never really said anything much to me about anything I did apart from anything that was connected with Manchester. But I got the feeling that he had yes, absolutely. And he knew. I mean, it was interesting in broadcasting as well. a lot of people he gave the first break to or worked for him very early on have gone on in broadcasting to be national figures, to be nominated for Oscars, to become incredibly influential broadcasters themselves. And Tony, in a way, stayed on a level, oddly enough, as a lot of his old colleagues went on to run TV companies and become, politicians and become national figures. Tony, for all his ambition, seemed quite happy to just be here. He didn't become the Paxman or the Dimbleby. He didn't become a more sort of orthodox broadcasting operator. And it was the same with what happened in music. A lot of people he inspired, and broadcasting and journalism, a lot of people he inspired have gone on to do other things that superficially appear to eclipse him. But what's interesting is I've noticed is that, especially just as the book comes out and you think, oh, maybe as Tony drifted back into the 20th century, that the energy is immediately released again.
Yeah.
People are still kind of intrigued by him. They're still inspired by him. They're still motivated. They're still annoyed by him. They're still wondering what happened. They're still sort of saying, well, he's overestimated. He didn't have that much impact on the city. It's ridiculous to say so. Or they're saying, well, of course he did. The city wouldn't be the way it is without him, and that we miss him. One thing I did notice, and I don't know, I managed to get it in the book very late because I forgot to put it in, so I don't know if it's in the version you've actually read, but there was a meeting, I don't know if you were at the meeting, John, where Sir Richard Leese threw a meeting at the local council.
It's in the book. Yeah.
It's in the book, yeah, good.
In the book, yeah.
And 30, 40 of us, people, the journalists, the entrepreneurs, the celebrities, Coogan's there, everybody that 30, 40 people, and Leese is looking for ways to remember Tony. And of course, the one person that we needed to be there, to have the energy, to keep this focus was Tony, and he wasn't there. It reminded me a little bit of when John Peel died. And to replace John Peel as a DJ, you needed about 40, 45 different DJs. And it was the same with Wilson. You couldn't just have one person that was suddenly going to be a Wilson and come along with that energy and that vision, and that you couldn't really have another Wilson that would just pop up, combining all those elements and all those characters and all that knowledge and all that vision and all that ambition and all that belief in the Northwest spirit. And even the 30 or 40 of us that were there weren't going to be enough. And I remember thinking, oh, that's significant, because he's gone now, and now it's going to get a little bit more mundane, because those little elements that twist things and warp things and distort things and that seem highly irritating when you're the personal target of it are really necessary if anything's going to get done. That way you would wind up the local council. I think of them in the 80s when they were just trying to do a shopping centre and compete with Stockport and Barnsley. And he was wanting them to, compete with Sydney and Paris and Los Angeles and get the Olympic Games. And he was winding them up as well, And he never wanted to be an official in that sense. He didn't want to join officially politics or join officially anything, the music industry. None of that. He never joined it officially, but he was always in there churning it up. Some thought he looked incredibly naive doing it. Some thought he looked incredibly sort of superficial. But that energy, that provocation, was a necessary factor. I think it's a necessary factor that gives Manchester not just the tall buildings and the hacienda as the new sort of yellow submarine, but it still gives Manchester something else, some other spirit that might dwindle, to some extent because Wilson isn't around. But it makes Manchester different than it might have been if he hadn't have been around. So even if those tall buildings go up, not because of him as such, there's no doubt that the spirit of the city still works and he still haunts it, and which would make the city very different if he hadn't have been around. The tall buildings might still have gone up, but it needed someone like Wilson to just bring forward that other stuff and create the connection with the innovative history of Manchester.
I think in a sense that I don't think they would have gone up. I remember in the 80s, he would go on about this, the vision of Manchester in the future, lots of people living in the centre, a bit like New York, and everyone thought he was crazy. And
that's right, yes.
One of the sad things is he's not been around since. If he reappeared today, which he could do in your book, he could be walking down the street and he would not be bamboozled by it. He'd be going, where's the rest of them?
That's right. And it's true, because that's the thing that is difficult to explain to the naysayers who doubt that, if you like, a pop culture figure or a local broadcaster could have such an influence. But of course, it's setting one thing in motion. One thing begins, then the momentum is created, and Wilson set the direction a certain way so that Manchester city centre is filled with loft apartments, and it's filled with this. I mean, when I'm walking, through Ancoats to the Etihad from Piccadilly, it feels like those apartments along the canal and the mills, what's happened to them and everything is the tribute to Tony. That's the sculpture in a funny sort of way. Whether you think, oh yeah, but they're just, a bit flat pack, a bit habitat. But on the other hand, it is extraordinary when you think of what it was once like that has happened. This modern spirit, and I do connect that absolutely with Tony Wilson. None of it would have happened that way. And you're right, the buildings go up for a different reason and a different sort of demonstration of local self-belief. But it comes from the fact that he was around to set it in motion.
He gave the city its self-belief because of his empowering and challenging nature. And the city centre is the statue. So that meeting of 30 people, it was already there. It's already getting built all around everybody, wasn't it?
Exactly. That's that. I like to think of it in that way, and that sense that Elliot Rasmussen was always very interested in this statue of Wilson that would be taller than the Beetham Tower. It would be like Chairman arms outstretched, and as you come in on the train, you could see it, and it'd be like the Angel of the North times 20. But in a funny sort of way, there's a lot in the city that is that. It's just not directly, all the hotels, all the, because Tony was the first person up. It was so many firsts. And Tony was the first person I remember staying in what they called a boutique hotel. Because, of course, when he went to New York in the early 80s, he would be staying at Morgan's. And you could tell by the name Morgan's that this was a different kind of hotel. And he had this early fascination with, designers like Philip Stark. And in a way, that spirit is distributed through Manchester in a Peter Saville, be careful what you wish for sort of way, because when you get it, you kind of go, oh, right, is this it now? But on the other hand, if you just distance yourself slightly from that sort of natural cynicism, it is remarkable that happened to a city that in the 80s, even the 90s, if I'm right, the city centre was pretty dead at night and nobody was there. Nobody was living there. The idea of people living there. And for a while, he was one of the few that did in this sort of isolated sort of place where you just thought, why is Tony living here? This is the middle of nowhere. But of course, he was saying, come. He was the first. He was always the first with the mobile phone, first with the USB stick around his neck, all these weird firsts, because he was that as well. He was a historian, but he was also very much a futurist.
Future historian in a sense.
Yeah.
So I mean, and that kind of argument between what the city's become now and people kind of celebrating but hating it all at the same time is part of this narrative as well. Like with Tony as a figure and Tony himself, and the contradictions very Mancunian.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, whatever he did and however much he got involved in things that had a sort of avant-garde element, it was still always rooted in a northern spirit that goes back centuries and a sense of humor that goes back centuries. And even though he was a different kind of northerner, he wasn't like the usual northerner you get. He threw different shapes on it. It was still directly connected with a northern spirit that he's managed to fling into the future. And at times like this, especially with all sorts of weird events and moments and diseases and social media companies happening, the idea of maintaining that spirit within it is quite abstract. But I think it's something else that Wilson did, that we don't all become generic, we don't all become part of a herd mentality. And I love the fact that even as that Hacienda's happening and he could be having number one hits with dance music, he's fiddling around with Fred and Junior Vermerel on strange odd subversive tactics, and that's really what he loved the most. He didn't want to take the easy option. He didn't want to just turn Factory into what it could have been, which was just having nice comfortable hits of the moment, because that's not the point. The point was that it should be difficult. The point was that when something happened that had a national and even international impact, because it was difficult to do, it had more of a place, more of a meaning, rather than the easy way. That's why I loved him, that he was so angry when people tried to do market research for him, and try and work out who was coming to one of his conferences or whatever. He would be at his most angry then, because it's your instinct, it's your understand. I mean, he had it, so he presumed, I guess, everyone else had it, and if they didn't, it was up to them to get it. That's what you should be looking for, not market research, but honing your own instincts, your own sense of the future. Well,
the buzz for him, and I'm working with, with the Vermorals at that point in time, is it the ideas that he finds fascinating, or maybe getting those ideas into the mainstream?
I think it's like a research and development department almost. The idea that what often eventually becomes the mainstream has started in an avant-garde area, usually a subversive area, and then it's finding a way to smuggle it into the mainstream without losing its essential tang, its spike, its spirit, its subversive element. And the fact that you could now it seems natural that Unknown Pleasures, for instance, is part of a canon. It's part of the 30 greatest albums of all time. It's the T-shirt. It's traveled forward. In 1979, that, as much as we said it to ourselves because we were making the myth, I don't think we would have considered that would have happened. We believed it. We believed it belonged with the Velvet Underground and Roxy Music, but that was part of what we learned from Wilson. Say it, keep saying it, and it comes true. And it came true. But what's interesting is that there was no guarantee that would have been the case, because it was not something that usually made the mainstream. It wasn't something that usually got talked about. But somehow over time, because Wilson did that, did the unusual underground things connected with a more Maverick spirit, it filtered into whatever he did that did make it into the mainstream. And I think he was very good at that, in a way that he understood seeing other people do it, and some of his favorite managers, you Andrew Loog Oldhams, or your Albert, your Grossman. I think he was fascinated with those kind of characters, because obviously that's where the myths were coming from, not from the musicians, like that great battle he would have, as we all do to an extent, with Hooky. No, Hooky, it's not really the music. It's all this other stuff that's really, really what is the beautiful myth, And he was really good at that, I
mean, in many ways, when we talk in that context, do you think that Tony was an artist? Not necessarily a singer or a guitar player or a painter or a photographer, but an artist who used ideas as his palette.
Yeah, he created his work of art out of a life, which was a very situationist idea. The idea of building your how people remember you, not out of physical objects as such. Other people would create those on his behalf or for him or because of him or in spite of him. But what he did was basically construct Tony Wilson, Anthony H. Wilson, Mr. Manchester, St. Anthony, construct a series of pieces that were as much works of art as anything else. And I guess that's just because, his understanding of history, his love of history, his love of the great characters that survive after they're dead. Whether explicitly or not, he must have understood those forces and understood that sort of area. The idea that we remember him and think of him now as if to some extent he is still here is a sense that what he did in his life was create such an extraordinary sort of impression upon us that is as vivid as any work of art in that sense. But when you look, what is that work of art? Well, it's Tony. It's obviously all the factory 501s and the buildings and the music, but none of that was directly him. What we are remembering as the work of art is Wilson himself.
And how much of a driving force was situationism for him? I mean, was it the actual basic philosophy of it, or was it actually the poetry of it? Because a lot of the situationist texts are actually really great to read as works of art, as poems, aren't they, in a sense?
Yeah. I think also, when he was more self-deprecating, he would say just like the slogans. But I think also there was something about the spirit of the time, that sort of energy, that reading of the world and creating an alternative reality, set of realities that competed with the realities that we are given by the powers that be. And the idea that, in fact, they're all illusions. Everything is an illusion. And the illusions that dominate our lives tend to be dictated by the establishment, politicians, corporate forces. The idea that what you could do is you could set up oppositions to that. And I think there was a sense of games playing with that. There was a sense of mischief. And there was also a sense that it was important, that otherwise we would just, as sort of, it's sort of definitely happening now, we tend to be crowded out by the illusions that are controlled by rather mundane people. And he wanted to have the illusions in the control of the poets and the philosophers and the musicians and the lovers and the dreamers. in that sense, he really was an arch romantic. You know, he was fighting a serious battle, a serious war, and situationism gave him a clue, however seriously he took it or not. But he was fascinated by it, and he would, you know, very early doors, he would be sending us all, you know, leaving the 20th century, the little green volume. He turned up at my house in a cab one day, you know, out of the blue. You know, it was his manifesto, it was his Bible. But by the very nature of that, it meant he didn't just dwell on it. He tried to make it happen in his own way. And I think because it had a subversive, wicked, mischievous element, it filtered through into everything he did, even when sometimes the broadcasting, you know, there would be elements of Tony, the prankster, the merry prankster, the subversive within his broadcasting, even on the tea time, you know, news. You know, there was still a sense that anything might happen at any minute. Even as he was doing something quite formal. So I think, and especially when the Sex Pistols and McLeod came along and their own connection through Jamie Reed with situationism, and you know, I think that kind of agitated what was possibly going dormant. You know, that playfulness that he could have, and you know, sometimes you got the feeling he fell into things accidentally or backwards or from the side. But once he was in, he really dealt with them with relish, you know, that sense that Andy Harris from Granada, who now kind of is producer on things like The Crown and did the film The Queen, you know, and started working for Tony, you know, he just reckoned that Tony, you know, he was so sort of had such appetite that even working for Granada and having that, which for most people would be enough, he was still pretty bored and he needed something else, you know. And then he found it through Alan Erasmus with those early factory, you know, gigs in Hume and with Duarty Column, and then the factory sample. And to some extent, it could have stopped there. It could have been a vanity publishing element from a weird local celebrity, you know. But I think every time something happened, he got more excited and possibilities opened up. And because very early on, he was fascinated by situationism, and it starts to appear, you know, directly nicked or appropriated through the sandpaper sleeve or the name Duarty Column. You know, he starts to realize that you know he can fill in the empty spaces in his head in a way that no other mainstream broadcaster would have even begun to think about. You know,
so it's mainly driven something internally for him, or was he driven in a sense of the whole world, or was it a mixture of the two?
Yeah, well, I think he had a community-minded spirit. You know, we used to laugh when he said, you know, they'd open the hacienda for the people, for the kids, because Tony was very good on saying the kids. Tony could say the kids, you know, and somehow just about get away with it. But I think he meant it. You know, he meant, why can't we have a say on what goes on in the city, as opposed to just the politicians and the usual sort of capitalists? You know, that was a big dramatic thing, not only to think but then to do. We should have a say what goes on in the city, and to an extent, the way we teenagers and whatever came after them had a say what went on in the city was always in those dark underground spaces, in the clubs and the back of the pubs and the rehearsal rooms. That was where traditionally, you know, you could find space. But then the idea of taking it to the next level, that it moves into the surface of the city as well. So it's not always just in the underground places for a few people, that it starts to spread. And you know, even if a lot of it was made up as he went along, it was rooted in some kind of understanding that there was an importance to what he was doing. You know, it wasn't just done for the sake of it. You know, I think that's why he was so sort of combative and so sort of uncompromising as well. You know, he had in his own mind a certain direction he wanted to go in, and he would be very unforgiving about anyone who got in his way or contradicted him seriously. Not if they call him the wanker and this kind of thing. That he loved, because that was him winning in his own way, because he was making an impression. His performance was working.
But was he like that anyway, or was that just a necessary kind of means? You had to be the hammer, or was he just like, well, he would have been like that wherever he did as part of his personality?
I think it's quite funny, the only child, and in a way having three parents, you know, all who treated him as a golden child, you know. So from very early on, he felt that he could rule the world. I think he had that attitude, you know, he could be a king. And then, getting to Cambridge encourages that idea he could be a king. And then it all seems to keep going well. He goes to ITN and starts writing news broadcasts, that go out to the entire nation. He's got power. He's only in his early 20s. So, and then the fact that his first girlfriend had previously been out with John Lennon and Paul McCartney. All these things are building up, the sense that he is someone, because he keeps making connections with people and situations that make him feel he has power, and he's treated, as if he does. So I think that also was why very early on, when we came across him in Manchester in the early to mid 70s, he was such a peculiar character because he had so much power coming out of him. And when you try and piece it together, you begin to realize why. All this stuff had happened already. He was winning debating prizes. He was going to Cambridge. He was going out with, John Lennon and Paul McCartney's ex-girlfriend. He was in his head, he was someone, and he just kept wanting to be someone, and he kept being someone, even if sometimes, it was too hot to be close to.
I mean, this book is kind of tinge of sadness, obviously, because Tony died young and it's unresolved. But the last few years of his life, they did seem to be drifting a bit, and you do sort of deal with that in the book as well.
Yeah, well, I think once you've done, things as magnificently as Tony had done in terms of his successes, which boil down to, say, Joy Division, Happy Mondays, the Hacienda, people tend to sort of want that. They want that again, exactly that, rather than the equivalent of that, which would be immediately unrecognizable because it wouldn't be connected with that. And Tony's interests were to not just repeat. He was forced often to be nostalgic and sentimental against his better judgment, and people kept making films about him, and they kept putting him in films and forcing him to look back, and he resisted. He didn't like that. He wanted to move forward. But the pull was, when he tried to do his Northwest regeneration in the early 2000s, the general view is, well, why don't you just give us another Happy Mondays? And then to some extent, he sort of yields to that, and he does Factory 2, Factory 3, Factory 4. He tries to do it all again. But of course, it's immediately nostalgic. It's immediately referring backwards in a way that his original stuff didn't obviously do. It was just out of nowhere. And I guess the characters like Tony, personalities like Tony, they have a time, and then often the rest of your life as an artist, sometimes when you've had a moment and a period and you've had your acclaim, other things happen, and you're spent fighting, and the only way people recognize you is for what you've done, not for what you're trying to do. And to that extent, the sadness of the early death, there's an inevitability about that as well, because it stops that short. It stops Tony having to keep being Mr. Manchester or being, Mr. Hacienda, long after he really wants to play that role. And he doesn't have to play that role anymore. Now he could be Tony Wilson, deceased, Tony Wilson, the ghost, Tony Wilson, the significant piece of history. Something else is released that stops it having to be a sort of sad petering out of an extraordinary life, So the energy in the end hits something hard, and maybe it always had to. And of course, as Lindsay Reed in the book keeps saying, Death Factory, Death Factory, Death Factory. Factory had a lot of death in it. The Ians and the Hannets and the Gretons. People were falling. People gave a lot to it, and Tony gave a lot to it and sacrificed a lot of his life, because to give so much in your life to a vision, a belief system, is going to take its toll. And it did with Tony, because he gave so much, and he had such an addictive personality as well, and there's a sadness about it, but also it seems to release a wonderful myth that in a way was what he tried to define himself all along. He made a series of myths and he became a myth, and whatever a myth is in the 2020s, Tony's a great example of something and someone that is, because we still seem very intrigued by him, and trying to work it out and him out,
Is that when you write this book, the book, there's a sense of responsibility to get it the right way, getting the right, for want of a better word, tone to it, do you feel that on you? Do you feel his voice in the back of your head going, nagging away at you, shouting at you, arguing with you?
Yes, I feel that about a lot of things I do. Sometimes when you do things, don't know if you have this, John, but there's a few people in your head you think, oh, I hope they like this. And obviously with the Tony Wilson book, one of them is Tony Wilson. It's not that he likes it, that it's a piece of I adore him, and I wanted to get a sort of element of some of that irritating, impossible, the bugger, the sulker, the annoying character in there as well, but also. I kind of felt that it was important to get that sense that history becomes like a dream as well. There's and that you never know, which is classic Tony, what is true and what isn't true. Some things I don't resolve. Some people are annoyed that I don't. They say it's the lack of research, but of course it isn't. That I haven't said, well, what degree did he get? That I haven't said, did he officially ask you to write the book? That I've kept, but in a way that was part of Tony. The idea of revealing all the mystery, revealing everything, isn't actually going to give you any kind of objective truth, because it will still be, unstable. And that's what I was saying at the beginning. The idea of writing a biography about Tony Wilson really enables you to tackle that idea of reality versus myth very explicitly because of Tony, because that's how he would operate. He wasn't too interested in the facts as such. He liked moving the facts around, creating other facts. And that's what I've done. I've wanted to create a book where a lot of it gives you a sense of structure, and this happened and then that happened, as far as we will ever know. But a lot of it could also be fiction. It could be a dream sequence. It might not have happened. Tony does turn up in the book to start talking. Well, how did that happen? Well, at the end in the acknowledgements, I reveal the illusion, but I wanted a lot of that as well. So Tony speaks after he's died. How does that happen? Well, it can happen, obviously, nowadays. And the fact that sometimes the forming of Factory, the phone calls with Alan Erasmus, how do we ever know what they were? Because Alan ain't going to tell you, doesn't remember, doesn't want to tell you. But you want to get across that, because a lot of the important things happened in these late night phone calls, and they become like dream sequences that are just as real, as truthful as the so-called hard facts.
Yeah, that's what I really love about the book. And I think it's far more important to capture the feeling, the texture and the nuance of a person than just boring. At 9:18, he turned up at Granada to a new spot or something. I mean, that wouldn't be Tony at all, would it?
No, and also reflect the characters he came across at Granada, all the people he knew, also with their own Wilsonian elements as well, in the way that their lives are unstable and you don't quite know. So a lot of characters pop up and disappear again to argue with Tony or agree with Tony, whether it's, his boss at Granada or Keith Allen or something. And they also have a slightly dreamlike quality as well, in the way that a life ultimately becomes a kind of dream. So you absolutely want to say, well, this happened. We are very aware this happened. We have some occasional evidence. But on the other hand, you can never be entirely sure it happened in this particular way. And nothing will ever convince me you can really pin that down. And if you try and pin it down, it can become very banal and boring, which is the exact opposite of Tony. He was always alive. He was always a kind of a combination of energies. And I guess that's what I needed to put into a book, without the book becoming formless and shapeless. And although there are those that say, oh, it's a bit haphazard, I can assure you it is not haphazard. Everything is there in a particular place for a particular reason to get across that kind of weird nature of a life that is continually both the past, the present, and the future. And for me, Tony embodied that. And that's what I wanted to get across in a biography about him.
Do you think, obviously he's building his own myth as he's going along, but he had a sense of this, the playfulness, and maybe also, and I would see it as a good word, but the haphazard nature of the story is something he was aware of while he was alive and playing with that myth as well.
Would he? Yeah, because he didn't really get bogged down in orthodoxies or sort of conventions and traditions, and if they were there, like playing with them. I think he knew early on, or came to realize the way things would happen is just by combining unexpected elements. And a lot of the time it might not work, it might not go anywhere, but when it did, it would be really successful, because the things he loved the most, I think, came out of those, whether it was a book or a poem or a song or a singer. He realized very early on that those things came out of mysterious forces, mysterious elements. And he didn't want to ever spoil that. And although he became, a local celebrity and he became, well known, he still didn't want to lose that side of him that didn't want to. I mean, he was a newsreader, for goodness sake. I mean, there's nothing more ridiculous about trying to tame the truth and put it in a box and present it to people. So he had an acute awareness of its absurdity just through that occupation that he could then take to the other things he did. That in that sense, he was an absurdist, because he realized we're meant to be manufacturing and distributing the truth, but there is no such thing. Because I see the process. He saw the process at ITN, writing for Alistair Burnett and Reginald Bosanquet, the Sandy Gall, these great iconic newsreaders of the early 70s. Tony's in there as a witness, realizing truth is manufactured, and therefore you can manufacture truth to be more biased towards your own desires and impulses, and I guess that was at the heart of how he operated, with his experience in the lies of truth at high level broadcasting. He could then sort of, distribute a different form of the news.
In a way, he'd seen beyond the charade and just playing with it as well.
Yes, yeah, definitely. That's what he enjoyed doing the most. All the situations he would set up at his conferences and looking for fights and arguments, and he would never be more. He was mostly satisfied when it did end in a kind of chaos, and he loved doing that in meetings. Making it go a bit wrong and no one quite knew where they were, and never being. I think it says in the book, never bothered with the detail. It will take care of itself. And I guess that's the spoiled only child about him as well, that you didn't have to worry about the details, because whatever chaos he caused, somehow it would be cleaned up around him and it would all make sense. And he could come back to it and say, oh, it had made sense, I
like the bit in the early part of the book where he's actually, for want of a better word, grooming you to be the writer of the book. So it's quite interesting, that idea that even very early on, he had a sense that his myth would one day be a book. Who's going to write this book? And somehow he dumped it on you.
Yeah. And that happens really early on. So when he says, I want you to write the book, this is about 1980. And it was ridiculous to think there would ever be anything like that. And that's what we were involved in. It could have all fallen apart at any minute. And to some extent, it was beginning to fall apart for various reasons, and he was very sure about this. And of course, you never knew if he was joking or if he was serious, but he knew, and therefore, if he hadn't have said it, would it have come true? Because then I've always got that in my mind. He planted something in my mind, and I did end up, and I have ended up writing 3 or 4 books where that story is told. It's ridiculous. And every time I write it, I think, I don't want to write it, but I have to write it. I'm doing it again. He's got me. He's managed to say something to me in 1980 that has ended up in 4 or 5 books.
Yeah. Oh, was that the taking to see Ian Curtis in the mausoleum?
Yes, but he takes me to see the body of Ian Curtis, which is just strange. And and my own father had killed himself a couple of years before, so it's ultra strange when you think about what he's doing. And he takes me there in the car to Macclesfield and shows me, and I'm obviously stunned and a bit pale. Rather pathetically, I'd taken a bunch of flowers. I always remember that. And afterwards, we're in the car, and Tony says, "You see, you're writing the book, Paul, so you need to know everything that happened, and you need to see these things," because he could see I was a bit out of it, But for him, it was all part of the thing, and not maliciously. I mean, he he certainly hadn't been given any kind of permission by the family, so it was very odd. But he genuinely meant it as the contribution to the possible creation of art around what he was doing. That in his head, it was obvious that people would be writing about this stuff. He said, I remember he was sort of saying, yeah, Joy Division are like Pink Floyd, and people will be writing books about Pink Floyd, so we have to be ready for it,
Yeah.
It was madness, but by saying it, he kind of made it happen, and he would do that again and again. And obviously a lot of things he said disappeared, but a lot of things he said didn't disappear and became something,
I mean, that was make him seem like a quite a cold-hearted person, but he wasn't at all, was he?
He wasn't really done like that. That's the trouble when you do talk about it. And obviously he got in trouble when he sort of said it in a northern way to the writer Nick Kent of The NME, who didn't get the northern angle of it. That's thing when, Barney would say things like, Ian was topping himself. And when I once asked, New Order who the laziest member of the group was in about 1990, Hooky went, "Oh, Ian Curtis hasn't done anything for 12 years." But coming from the outside, no one kind of got that. So Tony could come across sometimes as if he was being the manipulator. And of course, people wanted to read that into it in the McLaren sense. They wanted it. they wanted him to be. So in that sense, Wilson was very good at sort of encouraging people to create something for himself that he didn't necessarily do. But when it looked like he had tried to manipulate the death of Ian Curtis, he got very upset about that, because that wasn't playing the game. You know, it wasn't in this fictional space. It was trying to be dragged into a more tabloid space, which he didn't appreciate, and wanted that eradicated from the evidence. You know, but it's kind of it was never cold. You know, it was more almost for the joy of it, and not letting Ian down. If it had all collapsed after Ian died and nothing had carried on, and the Hooky and Bernard and Stephen had just gone their own separate ways and not made music, that would have been a dreadful betrayal of Ian. The fact that what came next, you know, was the Hacienda and was New Order, and it continued, you know, that's a better way of sort of continuing Ian's own particular energy, rather than it just all falling apart. So it seemed it was difficult sometimes to push through the way that people want to tell the story, but it was a generosity that Tony had. You know, he loved people, and I think he definitely loved Ian. And the idea of just stopping then seemed worse to him than somehow keeping going. And same with Rob, you know.
Yeah, I think in many ways his Achilles heel was he actually was quite a big-hearted person, wasn't he?
Yeah, he
wasn't hard-hearted enough to actually get to the top.
That's right. Yeah, he was a bit of a softie, oddly enough, for someone who played a belligerent bastard, you know. But then that goes to show that, you know, he was playing roles. You know, he was creating situations. Somehow he had a thick skin and could do it. But you know, you do get the feeling there were times when he was aghast and appalled and devastated and really low and thinking he'd fucked it up and how will he get out of this, and it's all falling apart, you know. But of course that wasn't in his eyes what people wanted from him, so he would try and hide that as much as possible, you know.
I mean, being an actor, and he'd done acting, is that key to all this as well? Was he performing a lot of the time?
Well, his dad being an actor as well, I think, you know, there's another little clue possibly of a facility he had, and the way that he could adjust his character for a different setting. I mean, the fact that he could whiz from factory to Granada in half an hour is indicate, you know, different roles. He's 1 minute he's doing Alan Ayckbourn, and the next minute he's doing Samuel Beckett, and he could just seem to just go from the two within a few minutes. And that must have taken a kind of acting, you know. I think that's sometimes why I had trouble with him when I was with him. You didn't know if he was acting, playing a role. What had you got him? Is this, you know, is he sincere now? Is he playing sincere? Which is a real, you know, it can really fuck you up, you know, if you're trying to work that out, you know.
Do you ever get the feeling you did get to him at all, or the oldest versions? Even the real version is just another version.
Yeah, well, I said, you know, because you never got him maybe in those hours before he went to sleep or as he woke up, you know, possibly there you were getting Tony forming himself for the day's activities or unforming after the day's activities, and you would get a kind of truth. But even with talking to his kids and his ex-wives, you just get the feeling that he was putting on a role for them as well. Bombastic, and you know, he's taking his kids to meetings, he's taking his kids to award ceremonies when they're 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. You know, it's like he's, you know, he's using everybody as part of his structure of his narrative. You know, putting them all in it, even his close family. So you get the feeling it would be very hard to get to that lonely, you know, real, if there is such a thing, Tony. And maybe after a while he lost all ability. Certainly in the 80s, 90s, you got the late 80s, 90s, you got the feeling he lost whatever it was that had been a bit real, that he kind of he got more interested in a more conventional kind of power, if you like. You know, I always think of his 90s as being the power decade, you know, when he was trying to sort of infiltrate the record industry and get involved in that, and you got the feeling that he'd lost sight a little bit of the more volatile Maverick Tony, you know. But that's just a judgment anyway. Who knows? Because we just don't know, you know, how much he was playing.
I guess he's also looking at being the mayor eventually. So
yeah, that's right. Yes,
instead of the unofficial mayor of Manchester.
Yeah, the real deal. And there is a world where that would have been both frightening and fantastic, you know.
I think it would have been fantastic. I think
and
I think,
frightening.
I think Andy Burnham does a version.
Well, exactly. He does a 50th, but he knows that he has to have a 50th because we're expecting that now. And and if it's Gary Neville, there's a bit of Wilson in Gary Neville as well, whether he knows it or not, because that's what makes it different and distinctive, for better or worse. Because anybody now that leads Manchester in that sense has to have a sense of Wilson, a knowledge of Wilson, because we've been led to believe that's the kind of person that should be leading things in Manchester, in the Northwest. It comes, with Andy, sometimes it just comes down to an open neck shirt, and you wish there was all this other knowledge that Tony had that was in there as well,
I mean, how much of Tony do you see in yourself?
I guess the hope. Yeah, I was going to use the word pretension, and I hate using that word, but that's a word that's often used with me. But I think it's a kind of intellectual ambition from when you come from the Northwest and you've got nothing as such, and no one wants to show you anything. And then when people like Tony or David Bowie or Matt Bonner show you things, and you learn and you go forward. I always wanted to do that. I wanted to know things because the South doesn't like that. And they always try and pin you down, especially if the way you try and learn things is within pop culture and within pop music, as they think. They just think it's irrelevant, and they try and pin you down. And Tony was very good at showing me that I didn't have to be worried about that. I could do that writing about popular culture. And even though it wasn't going to reach the mainstream in one sense, it didn't matter. It was more just doing that because you felt that ultimately it might be an inspiration to people in an indirect way, and also just having the freedom to move about without worrying too much about joining in with the herd, with the flow. That was always the Tony I liked, the anti-herd mentality. The fact that he did do occasionally things that reached the mainstream, but that they always had an absurdist, flamboyant, unusual quality. Undoubtedly, partly because of Tony, and because Tony was around. Because Tony was the first person, even if it was Alan Erasmus who found my fanzine out there, Tony was the first person to ever say, "You are a writer," because I'd just about started writing for the NME, but there was no, I meant professionally, a professional media person saying to me, "You are a writer." That is incredible. A moment of like, oh, really? Because no one had really said it. And I was just doing it for myself to an extent. So that's a weird sort of little detail that that it's a man off the telly, a professional journalist that's telling me, I'm a writer, and that was a great source of encouragement, But
he's empowerment for a lot of people. Key.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. In a way you didn't really think of at the time. And that was part of his generosity as well, But, the question you asked me was interesting about how I'm like Tony, because I don't think I am at all. But on the other hand, I couldn't be like I am without Tony. And, I consider him as much an influence on my life as any of the obvious people that you would say, a writer or a musician or whatever, an actor. Tony was a huge influence on my life. And maybe because it's the John Cage thing, John Cage would teach people not so that it would all end up like him, but that they would all end up as complete individuals. Maybe that's the ultimate influence that Tony's been on me, that I didn't want to be like Tony Wilson, but I wanted to be as distinctive and as individual as a Tony Wilson, as much as I could be. So, he didn't create clones. He created different sort of elements of energy that went out into the world that wouldn't have done what they did without, there being Wilson.
Yeah, I think that's probably very key to what he did. I mean, it's an interesting bit of the book where I think somebody talk about, but what does he do? People could work out what he did, but it's the empowerment, the energy, and creating the space for things to happen is an art form, isn't it?
It is, and very few people know it because they don't think it is anything, and it doesn't seem to be anything, and you can't see it. And to define it, it's taken me, 600 pages, and then I'm only scratching the surface. But that's the point, in a way,
Yeah, and talk about that. The 600 pages, was it a very different book for you to write, emotion, etc., because you're writing about somebody who's had a profound influence on your life, also from the same city. I know he's from Salford and you're Stockport, but the same part of the country and all these things, and part of the same era, and somebody you work very close with sometimes, somebody didn't speak to for years, other times. it's a different book, isn't it? It's not like Bowie or Dylan. They're writing about remote figures and what they mean to you, but this is something you kind of knew but didn't know, and how much of yourself gets threaded into this book as well? Because I imagine it's a very personal, personal book, isn't it?
Yes, but in the end, what the part that was personal I enjoyed about it was the task of writing a certain kind of biography, because I love biographies and I love the art form of the biography, and the fact that I have been given the gift by Tony of a fascinating, frustrating, complicated character to write a biography about, that also had elements of my own story. That as a writer was wonderful. So I never found it, even though to some extent it's taken me a long time, but there were different technical reasons for that, not least trying to get Alan Erasmus, which took about 6 years. And I wanted him in it, because usually he's not in it. And he moans about not being part of the history, but then he refuses to take part in the history. So I wanted him in it. But in the end, it was just like what was more interesting for me as the personal element. And to some extent, I don't put as much of me in as I could have done, because I still wanted to just be a ghostly presence in, as I would have been in Tony's story, because he knew so many people. I didn't want to make it look like I was the only person he knew. I'm also just coming through and making my contribution as much as anything else. But the opportunity to write such a book, such a biography, made sense of also why I've spent 45 years as a writer. Which is rooted back to the fact the first thing I ever did, that fanzine out there was something Tony had found and suddenly was in my life, and a consequence of that, oddly enough, is a book about the man who found that fanzine was selling. Yeah. And I wanted to get some of that trickery into the book as well. My presence in it because of that. I'm there because I'm one of those people that he's sort of found, encouraged, got to know, become part of his world. But I'm also in the book as the writer, and I'm also in the book because there's been a weird consequence of Tony Wilson's life that has led to me that writes that book. And I loved all of that. It wasn't, the only problem I had really was knowing when to stop, because it kept coming. The information, Peter Saville gets a CBE, or I've got to put that in. I noticed in the new Factory Arts Centre, they're going to put a Soho House. That seems very Wilsonian. So really, I should stop the book and put that in, So there's still, I quite like that still things are happening that I would want to put in the book, but eventually I have to stop,
Yeah, and I like that idea. There is no full stop. I mean, yes, Tony may have died, but he's still alive, and you see him everywhere in the city, even though he's not here. Yeah.
That's right. And in the book, he has the last word, really, because he's still there. He's still driving through the city,
I think he would like to have the last word.
Oh God, it's got to. Imagine how angry he'd be if I did.